Thank you. I first want to thank Megan and Anne and all of Fabry Australia for inviting me here. It is my first time to Australia, and it has been a wonderful experience, and I'm very grateful to have been invited. Let's see how this works. Right. So we'll talk a little bit about the psychosocial, but I'm not going to delve in depth in that since we're going to have the workshop immediately following, and we can get more in depth at that time. And then after that, I'll talk a little bit about the research that has been done, which Michael Chan provided a wonderful, brilliant summary of into neurocognitive aspects, and we'll go a little deeper into that for the second half of my presentation. I'll start by saying, with the psychosocial aspects, very little of what I say is going to be new to you or profound, since you are the individuals living with Fabry. However, even if it's not new, sometimes it's important to speak it out loud and talk about the things that we know, but we may not always talk about. So we're just going to breeze through those. So, before you get a diagnosis, my experience comes from working with people with Fabry for 10 years in the United States. Some of that experience may be the same here in Australia. Some of it may be slightly different. You can let me know. But it is what we often call an invisible disease. You can have a hard time getting your symptoms taken seriously, at least in our medical system, because you don't look on the outside as if there's something different about you. The symptoms are hard to pin down. Pain, as we've heard, is often one of the foremost symptoms in childhood, and that's something that you can't see. I can't see your pain. I can see your reaction to your pain. I can see your behavior in response to your pain, but I can't see your pain itself. And it doesn't show up on standard non-genetic tests. So children, in particular, may be accused of lying, malingering, like Pinocchio, to gain attention. This can have lasting effects. As an adult, the term is hypochondriac, but it means the same thing. You may be accused of making up medical symptoms for attention. Okay? Or you may be told by a doctor, this is psychosomatic. What you're experiencing is in your head. I used to do a talk called, It's Not All in Your Head. And you know that better than I do. The symptoms you're experiencing are not in your head, but it may sometimes be difficult to get them taken seriously. Or you may be misdiagnosed. A physician with good intentions may tell you, yes, I know what's going on, this is what it is. And they may offer you treatment for that diagnosis. But of course, the treatment doesn't really help because that's not the correct diagnosis in the first place. Okay? By the time you go through all of this, which can sometimes take years, this may be how you're feeling on the inside. Okay? I may not look sick, but you don't look dumb. And you may have developed a very valid mistrust or resentment or reluctance to believe some of what you hear from the medical professionals because they haven't done a great job of serving you so far. Okay. In our country, the hospital bills and the insurance are racking up as you go through this long process of trying to get your diagnosis. And then you finally do. Okay, now someone says, okay, this is what it is. It's Fabry. Okay, now what? Well, after your diagnosis, and these are some of the things that we're going to talk about in the workshop today, so I'm not going to go into depth right now. But as I said, there can be a mistrust of the medical system after years of misdiagnosis or accusations that you're pretending. Let's see, how do I turn this on. Women may have been told they were only carriers and left untreated. Can have an impact on marriages, on families, on siblings. There may be feelings of isolation and loneliness at coping with both symptoms and treatments that peers don't understand. Uncertainty over whether or not to have children. Uncertainty over when to tell someone that you meet for a date that this is a part of your life. Guilt at passing on the disease to your children, even though you know up here you didn't do that consciously. Still, there's a form of guilt that many people have shared with me. Uncertainty at living longer than their parents thanks to new treatments. One gentleman that I know told me, my mom died at 42. I thought I would too. And then they came out with ERT, and suddenly I'm not sure what my life is supposed to be like now. Chronic pain with potential for dependence on pain meds. Financial difficulties, difficulties maintaining a job, disability, they may call that something else here. Difficulties with expectations of you at work, at home, at school, and in the community. And sometimes those expectations are from others, and other times they're self-imposed. We have expectations of ourselves, what we should be able to do. And sometimes we need permission to be kind to ourselves and recognize that we are doing the best we can. All of those things can contribute to decreased quality of life, and sometimes to treatment compliance or non-compliance when a treatment is available, but for a variety of reasons, may not be something you choose to do at that moment in time. And I teach the students in our genetic counseling program that each person makes a decision based on what is best for them and their family, not based on whether there's a treatment available. Okay, so side effects can include anxiety, depression, a decrease in the ability to cope with everyday trials and tribulations, and the Fabry fog. We'll come back to the Fabry fog in a little bit. With regard to the anxiety and depression, we know that people who have Fabry report at a higher frequency that they experience anxiety and depression, not everyone, but at a higher frequency than people in the general population. What we don't know is whether that is a symptom of the Fabry itself or a reaction to living with a chronic progressive disease, or some combination of both, because they're not mutually exclusive. Okay. So what can you do? Well, this could be a much longer talk than I have time for today, but I do want to talk about some global things that help. Okay. Check for silent issues. This is the anxiety and the depression. For very good reasons, the kidneys and the heart and the pain tend to get the most exposure, the most concern. But when you're at the doctor, if she or he does not ask you about anxiety and depression, and you feel that that is something you may be experiencing, volunteer that information. Because it is important, not only to your overall well-being, but to your ability to function in daily life, and even to your cognitive abilities, which is what we're going to talk about in just a few moments. Okay? If you have access to a health psychologist, take advantage of that. Asking for help and seeking out assistance can be tremendously powerful, tremendously powerful. Psychologists don't just counsel, but we also do family counseling. So we don't just counsel individuals, but sometimes we do marital counseling, family counseling. We also do research. My job involves a great deal of clinical research to help us learn. Peer support. This conference is a beautiful example of peer support. I know many of you live across this country, which is a rather large one, and don't get to see each other all that often. Just being able to talk to people who understand your world is very therapeutic. It has its pros and cons, but it's very therapeutic, okay? With the increasingly advent of the internet and the creation of online means of connecting, support groups, advocacy groups, that can be done even if you're not at a meeting like this, okay? In the United States, sometimes we have infusion centers. I'm not exactly sure how it works here, if you're able to talk with other people getting their infusion next to you. We have an infusion center at Emory where the kids can get the little porta infusion things, I don't know the technical term, and they can play with each other on the floor if they're really young. Normalization. Normalization is very important, particularly as a parent raising children with any kind of chronic condition, helping them to grow up with a sense of themselves or reframing their sense of themselves as a strong person who happens to have a disease rather than a sick person or a victim. This seemingly small change in your outlook on life can have huge repercussions. Taking as much control over your health and your disease as possible. Participating in your healthcare choices, so not just doing what you're advised to do, but participating in the decision making. Yes, I understand my levels, I understand my symptoms, this is what's going on with me, and this is why this is the best next step for me. And beginning to teach teenagers transition skills now. That's the book that Dawn and I co-authored along with a pharmacist in the United States named Carol Ogg about transitioning. What are we transitioning from adolescence to adulthood? Transitioning disease knowledge, inheritance and reproductive chances, disease management and treatment. And how you do that is a little bit at a time. So when they're young, maybe 12, you help them start to make their own doctor's appointments, just picking up the phone and calling or doing it online and setting up the appointment. And maybe that's all you do with a 12-year-old. But each year, helping them start to learn a little bit more how to do things, how to set up their infusions, how to talk to their nurse about the symptoms. And when they go for their medical appointments and the healthcare professional is asking them questions, having them be the one to increasingly provide all the answers, and you just sit back and you're there to correct them if they say something or add something if they miss something, but increasingly let them take the lead. This helps so that when they go off and out of our homes into their own lives, they know how to do this. It's hard to let go, but keeping a sense of humor. There's so much ridiculous stuff that happens in this world and also in the healthcare systems, and sometimes the only thing you can do is laugh at it. Celebrating milestones, anything and everything you can celebrate, go ahead and do it. Making the most out of when you're having a good day, when you're having a good hour, when something goes right, make the most of that. It helps counterbalance when it doesn't. Other coping skills, advocacy. So I know many of you here have been involved in gaining the right to have access to treatments and other things here in Australia. All of that comes under advocacy. Educating the public, educating your physicians, finding your passion. Other than Fabry disease, what defines you? What is it you're passionate about? I really like being on stage in theater. It's not my living, but it's something that makes me feel alive, and I enjoy it. What makes you feel alive that has nothing to do with Fabry? And taking the time to invest a little bit of your life in that. A young man I know is a DJ. He really likes music. Someone else I know, well, I can share more about that later, but finding out what that is for you. Therapy. I wouldn't be a psychologist if I didn't talk about therapy. We have art therapy, music therapy, nature therapy, pet therapy, and sports. My husband and I went axe throwing with some friends because that was very popular in the United States for a while there. And as long as you wear closed-toed shoes, it's oddly therapeutic. The Fabry fog. All right, how many of you, whether you have Fabry or not, have noticed differences in your ability to pay attention? Okay, I have. I definitely have. Concentration, word finding. One of my students told me after a year that a year prior in class I meant to say the word organic, and instead I said orgasmic. And I didn't notice at the time, so all the students just went like that, and they could tell that I didn't notice, so they just didn't say a word. And she didn't tell me until a year had gone by. After which time, of course, I'm wondering, what else have I said that I don't know? Okay. Memory. Executive functioning, which is the frontal lobe, abstract thinking, planning, organizing. And then the question is, how do you know whether it's due to Fabry disease or due to something else? For example, normal aging. Well, the neuropsychological tests that we have, are huge sets of normalized data. So these tests have been used on people across the United States, in my country, and in other countries as well. And we have access to that data to be able to make comparisons between people with Fabry or people with any other disease and people in the general population. Okay, so I'm just going to run briefly through some of this because Michael Chan gave a brilliant summary earlier. So one of the earliest studies was in 2007. Extremely brief screening measures were used. The mini mental status exam and the NUCOG were actually developed more to be able to distinguish between people with early on signs of dementia than Fabry disease. So it's not necessarily going to pick up the sort of subtle difference that we may see with people with Fabry. They only used 17 adults, 15 men, 2 women. They found that these individuals with Fabry did slightly better on the attention questions than people in the general population, slightly worse in language, no evidence of cognitive differences in memory or executive functioning. Shermuli et al. Went slightly more in depth, but still fairly brief. They used a slightly larger number of subjects, 25 adults, little better balance between the genders, 10 men, 15 women. However, they only included subjects over 56 years of age. Okay. 20 controls. In contrast to the study we just talked about, these individuals with Fabry did slightly worse on items of attention. And although they found executive functioning deficits, that is, differences in the ability to plan and do abstract thinking, those differences vanished once they took into consideration the effects of depression. As we mentioned earlier, depression and anxiety do have an effect on your cognitive abilities, and when they took that in control, the executive differences vanished. 8 years later, they came back and got as many of the original subjects as they could for longitudinal testing, which found that there was an increase in the white matter lesions described earlier, but no decline in cognitive abilities. 2010, Segal et al. Tested 15 people, this time included children. Some deficits in information processing speed, maybe in executive functioning. Elstein et al., 10 people, again, very small numbers. 3 men, 7 women. They used computerized testing, and they found mild information processing deficits. Still not in-depth testing, still tests that kind of scratch the surface. Okay, Wadley et al. Tried cognitive testing over the telephone. Brief screening measure, about 30 minutes only, and the fact that it was over the telephone limited the kinds of tests that could be done, but much better subject numbers. 17 men, 37 women with Fabry disease. Again, they truncated the subject population, only people over 45. Okay. They also looked at global overall scores rather than by cognitive domain, and found no differences in those between Fabry and controls. Bolsover et al. Did a review at everything done so far in 2014 and said, well, okay, well, we don't know for sure. Fabry disease may possibly be associated with difficulties in attention, information processing speed, and executive functioning. However, a lot of the studies contradict each other's findings, have low sample sizes, use brief surface-level test measures, and often fail to control for depression. The recommendations were in-depth standardized neurocognitive tests. So unfortunately, that means asking you guys to sit there for a lot longer doing these kinds of neurocognitive tests. Covering all cognitive domains, larger sample sizes, looking at the whole range of adulthood and controlling for both depression and stroke, which of course stroke also can have an effect on cognitive abilities. So, in Australia, the first study that did a full neuropsych battery. I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce that name. Megan, how would you pronounce that name? Okay, then I'm not the only one. Slightly low sample size, again, only 17 adults, 15 controls, 12 men, 5 women. Only the men with Fabry showed slower information processing speed and reduced executive functioning. However, only the men had had strokes and had greater self-reported symptoms of depression and anxiety. So although we're making tremendous progress, we've got the first study that really used a good neuropsych in-depth battery, it's still a little complicated, confounding variables. 2018, this is in Denmark, 41 adults, an hour and a half of testing, 1/3 of the adults showed deficits. I think my slide is slightly askew here, but deficits in attention, psychomotor speed, and executive functioning. They found that disease severity and depression were not related to cognitive difficulties. So you would think that as your disease severity got worse, your cognitive impairment may get worse if there is cognitive impairment. That is not what they found. And that it was also not related to the level of depression that subjects were experiencing. Of particular interest, they looked at subjective perception of impairment. So how you feel you're doing in areas of attention, memory, concentration, etc. And then they compared that to how you actually did on the tests. And they found that it did not correlate. Okay? Some of the people who felt they were doing terribly were actually not doing that bad at all. And other people who thought they were doing pretty well were not doing that well. What they found was that the subjective perception of how you were doing had more to do with your depression level than your actual level of impairment. Okay, and I'm almost done here. Korver et al., and this is a Dutch study, 81 adults, again found, looked at subjective impairment, objective impairment, and depression to take those into account, found that 64% of the adults who participated reported subjective impairment, only 16 had objective impairment, primarily men who had had strokes, and this was primarily in executive functioning. Once again, subjective impairment was correlated more with level of depression than with actual deficits. What's one of the takeaways from this? To go back to what we said earlier, one of the takeaways is that we have to pay attention to anxiety and depression because they can have an effect on how we feel we're doing, regardless of how we're actually doing, how our perception of our life is and our cognitive abilities. So if people don't ask you, volunteer. This was a study that I did with someone here back home in Atlanta, looking at self-reported symptoms of attention deficit hyperactivity combined in the United States. ADHD is found in 4.1% of the population. Our adults with Fabry, 29% reported symptoms. And whereas I thought that the symptoms would primarily be in attention only, not hyperactivity, that turned out not to be the case. No gender differences. Finally, the study I'm doing now, all adults with Fabry are welcome to participate. I am flying adults from around the United States in. Unfortunately, I don't have the finances to fly you from Australia, but we're doing a full neurocognitive battery, 10 to 12 hours of testing, not all on the same day because your brains are fried, doing between and within comparisons, so between the group of people with Fabry and the general population, but also within the group of people with Fabry, are there certain areas? So are people generally doing fine overall, but have a dip in attention or a dip in memory? Looking to account for age, gender, depression, stroke, disease severity, treatment status, if I can, if there are enough people to do those comparisons. Also checking subjective impairment versus objective impairment impressions. We have done about completed 57 people so far. My goal is 80 participants. I hope to be able to report the results of that study to you at a later point in time. Thank you very much for your attention.